For the first time in a long time, we have direct evidence that migrants commit more crime than everyone else.
Is this the best and brightest we've been promised? Welcome to No Border, No Country. We're talking today about crime in the United States committed by people who have entered this country illegally. I'm joined as always by Judge Matt O'Brien. Matt, you had an opinion piece on FoxNews.com this week, co-authored by early senior fellow Tom Homan, and you were talking about this very topic. Give us a little bit of a summary on what you were trying to say there.
Well, for the first time in a long time, we have direct evidence that migrants commit more crime than everyone else. For years, people at places like the Cato Institute and others have insisted somehow that people who are in the United States illegally commit less crime. I think their theory was always these people are trying to fly under the radar, so they want to stay away from the attention of law enforcement. But of course, with the evolution of sanctuary cities and the tolerance that has been shown in the courts and in other parts of the criminal justice system for illegal aliens committing crime, that those arguments just haven't held a lot of water. And so we now have essentially the perfect laboratory experiment to try and test their hypothesis and see if it's true. We have a large number, larger than ever number of migrants who have been admitted to the United States. I should say they've been let in because they haven't been formally admitted. They've been allowed to run roughshod over the border unlawfully, come into the United States, and nobody is enforcing the immigration laws. And what's happening in places like New York City? Crime is through the roof. And we have seen over the last couple of months just story after story after story after story in the media about illegal aliens committing heinous crimes, rapes, murders, arson, kidnapping, crimes of violence against not just U.S. citizens, but against people in migrant communities. So this is not a us-them issue. This is a general public safety issue. And what we have is a direct correlation. Now, as I mentioned in the article, correlation is not always evidence of causation. But here, you would really have to be mathematically deficient and skilled at ignoring the obvious to say that, oh, no, there's no evidence that migrants commit crime at higher rates than anyone else. And, those arguments made by Cato and these other organizations never really held a lot of water to begin with, because they're ignoring the fact that if you're an illegal alien, you had to commit a crime to come to the United States. And generally speaking, you wind up committing a number of fraud crimes in order to work here unlawfully, open a bank account, and do all the things that Americans legally do every day without breaking any laws.
Now, before we dive into all the crimes that are being committed once some of these people enter the country, tell us a little more about the fact that simply by walking across that line in Texas or Arizona or California, you're committing a crime just by doing that, correct?
Yes. So immigration law confuses people a little bit because under 8 U.S. Code 1325, which is part of the Immigration and Nationality Act, that section of code is called improper entry by alien. And it says that it's a misdemeanor crime if you're a foreign national and you enter the U.S. anywhere except at a designated point of entry and you fail to be inspected by an immigration officer. And repeat offenses make that a felony. Now, there's a couple of similar provisions that apply to people who have been deported and then re-enter the United States. But the long and the short of it is, regardless of the way that the anti-borders contingent wants to portray this, entering the United States unlawfully is a crime. Now, because this has been such a large problem for so long, we don't charge everyone who enters unlawfully with that crime of improper entry by an alien. However, there's parallel civil authority that basically sets up unlawful entry by an alien as a civil trespass. And the remedy for that is that you remove the person from the United States, which is not a punishment. It's just a way of restoring the person to the place where they have lawful citizenship rights, which is typically their own native country. A lot of people get hung up on the civil versus criminal thing. it really doesn't matter. Even if you're not tried for it, if you come into the United States illegally, you have committed a crime.
Now, some of these anti-borders people you speak of like to push this narrative that what are people here legally being pulled over for, apprehended for, and it's this whole "your papers, please," and having you believe this is the National Socialist Workers' Party of the 1930s in Germany. But we're not talking about people being picked up for jaywalking or spitting on the sidewalk or anything like that. I mean, there's an article we pulled here on Border Hawk News, which is one of the few real great aggregators of these kind of incidents that the corporate media will not touch. Here's one in particular. Thrice deported illegal arrested for killing mother, two children in arson attack. Okay? It says, an illegal alien who has been deported at least 3 times was arrested for killing a mother and her 2 young children in an arson attack in California. Is this the best and brightest we've been promised?
No, certainly not. So, and I'd like to address something you said before about the German National Socialist Workers' Party and may we see your papers, please?
I love when you do that accent. It's great.
This is the most ridiculous argument in the entire world, because if you're a U.S. citizen and you run a stop sign or you run a traffic light, what happens? Law enforcement pulls you over and says, can we see your papers? Those papers are your driver's license and your registration. Now, this is where the whole argument about illegal immigration breaks down, because if you were to say to the nice Fairfax County police officer or the Virginia State Trooper, I don't have a license or a registration, I'm an undocumented driver, you know what you're going to be doing? You're going to be looking at the world through a set of iron bars. So this whole notion that somehow this is discriminatory, it's absurd. If I'm a U.S. citizen and I'm driving, I'm expected to have registered my ability to drive by getting a driver's license, and I am expected to have registered and insured my vehicle. So why is it unreasonable to, when a foreign national enters the United States, expect them to have appropriately registered with the government of the United States? It's just a silly argument that hits people of a certain bent in the feels, shuts their brain off, and they fail to look at the thing from a rational, reasonable perspective. And then, to your point, this is not people engaging in shoplifting, jaywalking, all kinds of other petty crime. These are serious crimes. That being said, though, how did Rudy Giuliani and the New York City Police Department clean up New York? They engaged in what was called broken windows policing. And the name came about because their theory was that if you took low-level criminality that happened in neighborhoods, like kids breaking windows on abandoned buildings, or people painting graffiti, or public urination, public drunkenness, even jaywalking, you fostered an atmosphere of lawlessness. And they said, we think if we reestablish an atmosphere of lawfulness, of obedience to the rule of law, what we will do is we'll, 1, encourage people generally to think that they need to be law-abiding, and number 2, a lot of people who have criminal tendencies engage in both low-level and high-level crime. And therefore, arresting a lot of these people for these low-level crimes, we will pick up a lot of the felons, and in a lot of cases, we'll pick up the potential future felons and dissuade them from committing a felony. But at the very least, we'll find a lot of people with outstanding warrants and unpaid court fees and deadbeat dads. I mean, you name it. And it worked. Now, in the academic literature, there is a whole lot of debate about whether this was successful or not. But if you read between the lines, most of the people that are claiming it wasn't successful are people that hate the criminal justice system just because it exists. If you look at the numbers and you look at the drop in crime that took place in New York City, I lived there while this was going on. I lived across the river in New Jersey, in Jersey City, which had not had a cleanup, and certain neighborhoods in Jersey City I would not advise anyone to go into in the daylight. I've heard it's gotten much better. But, I would regularly go out in New York City and be in Times Square at, because I was younger and single then, at 1 or 2 in the morning. And first of all, there were wall-to-wall police officers everywhere. But second of all, even if you happened to, get on a block where there wasn't a police officer visible, you felt perfectly safe. And that was because, Rudy Giuliani and later Mayor Bloomberg, despite his otherwise kooky leanings on some issues like giant Coca-Colas and trans fats, they were very serious about maintaining law and order in New York, and it worked. We now have a president who has done the exact opposite along the border and has basically encouraged everyone and their cousin to violate the border of the United States.
I remember vividly visiting New York multiple times during the Giuliani reign there, and it was the kind of place you could take young children on a vacation to Manhattan and walk the streets, even in the dark at night. It was so safe. And now contrast that with, you cite this in your Fox News piece, robberies in the Big Apple are up 300%. They say the increase is directly attributable to the mass influx of illegal aliens who have been treated to luxury hotels at taxpayer expense while they rob, I'm going to say that word, S-A, and pillage their way through the 5 boroughs. So we've gone complete 180 from the Giuliani era, and it's like Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome there now.
Yeah, it's crazy because they've done exactly the opposite. If you bring in people who are lawbreakers by nature and broke the law to come here, and I'm sure you have a lot of people in the anti-borders contingent going, well, they didn't really break the law. Joe Biden invited them. Well, Joe Biden doesn't make the immigration law. He's responsible for enforcing it. The Congress of the United States makes the immigration laws. And what you had was an entire administration say to people, yeah, if you break the law, you're going to get away with it. That sends a message to people that they break any law that they want and get away with it. And then you reward them for their bad behavior by giving them debit cards preloaded with cash, lodging in luxury hotels, food at taxpayer expense. I mean, if you wanted to break down a society and bring it to that Mad Max Beyond the Thunderdome stage, you couldn't have followed a better blueprint than they did in New York as far as welcoming the so-called migrants and then not holding them accountable for their bad behavior. I believe the Venezuelan young man who shot at the police officers when they were trying to pull him over for riding an unregistered motor scooter was out without bail the very next day. And what kind of a message does that send?
Yeah. Now a lot of these apologists on the anti-border side will come up with any excuse to defend this behavior, and they'll say, well, they're from poor countries and they're destitute and they're desperate, and anything to justify it. But what we've seen from the reporting, particularly the New York Post, has been one of the best sources to tell the truth about this. You've got these gangs that originated in Latin America that are here now. They're in Manhattan. I believe Tren de Aragua is the big one up there.
Yeah, the Venezuelan one.
They are now using these luxury hotels as recruiting hotbeds to get new soldiers in their gangs. They're getting these Vespas, these motor scooters, robbing people of their cell phones in broad daylight, taking the financial data off the phones, cleaning out the accounts, selling the phones back home in Latin America. This is not just a random act of criminality here and there. We're talking about, they're establishing criminal empires there as a result of this.
Yeah, of course. And the Venezuelan government, which is 100% diehard Marxist and hates the United States, I mean, generally speaking, street gangs composed of kids are not particularly adept at jailbreaking phones, stealing financial data, and then making the phones usable by end-user consumers in Latin America. So it makes you wonder, is the Venezuelan intelligence service involved in this, or is the Venezuelan intelligence service acting as a proxy for another intelligence service? I mean, the places where this could go wrong, from organized crime involvement to foreign government involvement, is crazy. And the other thing is, we knew this was going to happen. This has happened before. This happened during the Mariel boat lift when the Cuban alleged refugees were coming here, and Castro emptied the jails and sent all those folks to the United States. Anybody who's ever seen Scarface will be familiar with that story.
How many modern versions of Tony Montana have come through as a result of all this? And we're seeing it right now.
Well, apparently like 300% of them in New York. I mean,
It's unbelievable.
You know.
So you mentioned the Venezuelans. We talked about that. That leads to the next thing. There was an article in Daily Signal recently. Venezuela is exporting violent crime problem to U.S. So this has been in the political bloodstream of this country lately, that prisons in these Latin countries are being emptied out, and then, of course, the people here say, oh, well, that's not true. They're not doing that. Here's a little citation from this story. Venezuela's rate of violent deaths dropped to its lowest level in more than 2 decades following years of massive migration as both criminals and victims fled the nation's economic crisis. So their crime rates are going down. They're sending all these people. Our crime rates are going up. It doesn't take a genius to figure out what's going on here.
Well, and here's the interesting thing. The crime rates in a lot of these countries have been going down for years because the U.S. spends millions upon millions of taxpayer dollars on what's called OPDAT, which is the Department of Justice's overseas prosecutorial assistance and training program. And so they go into countries all over the world, not just Latin America, but we spend a lot of money in Latin America, and they train police officers and prosecutors. They fight corruption. They encourage prosecutors to actually pursue charges against people. They have special programs for violence against women. So to begin with, the claims about gang violence and domestic violence these people are making in support of their asylum claims are absurd. But then it also appears that the governments in a lot of these countries are driving their crime rates even lower by emptying their jails and by politely encouraging any known criminals who haven't been put in jail to flee the country and head to the United States. And this is part of an ongoing problem that the U.S. has had with regard to Latin America and the Caribbean basin. The countries in those regions have for years said, well, you keep deporting all these people back here who are criminals, and they engage in criminal behavior. And the U.S. government goes, well, they're your citizens. You have an international law obligation to take them. And then they say, oh, well, some of these people, went to the United States as children and were criminalized and trained as criminals in the United States, and now we have to deal with them. Which, of course, is a silly argument because there's no guarantee that those people wouldn't have become criminals in their own country. Criminal behavior usually starts to manifest itself early and tends to be based on personality characteristics. So generally speaking, if somebody was going to be a criminal, they were going to be a criminal no matter where they were. And why is this the United States problem? If somebody was allowed to live in the United States, which is a law and order country with free public education and free assistance for people, and they still become a criminal, it's our responsibility to cure that person of their criminal tendencies when they're a foreign national who's never become a U.S. citizen. And it's just the arguments with all this stuff are beyond absurd. They don't make any sense. And I think that has been used as a political justification in Latin America by a lot of the leaders down there for doing this. And this is where we're going to get back at the junkies to the north, and they can have all our criminals because they can deal with them.
So the activists on the other side of this issue are very fond of playing the sentimentality card. They will find the most sympathetic-looking single mother with 5 kids and say, how could you deny her the right to escape the violence of her homeland and this sort of thing? You referenced this earlier, that a lot of this criminal element coming across are inflicting some of the most pain on those very people because they live among those people in these new immigrant communities, whether legal or illegal, and they're the easiest target for these people. So if you care so much about these people, why are you for this border stampede that's allowing them to prey upon these people? And why are these people being allowed to come in here and be subjected to this violence?
Because this has nothing to do with the actual people. The most vociferous parties in the anti-borders contingent are not actually concerned with people. They're more concerned with the fact that they do not think that the Westphalian independent sovereign nation state is the ideal model of government. They think that world government by organizations like the UN and the European Union that relies on centralized control by unelected technocrats who make solutions based on efficiency and business principles rather than on the kind of governmental principles that prevail in the United States. They think those people should be in charge. So the important narrative is that the U.S. is bad and its borders should be meaningless. And the way you can see that this is true is if you look at the arguments that the anti-borders contingent makes with regard to migrants. When migrants are in their own countries, they portray them as hapless idiots with no agency. And this is not me saying that. This is coming from the side that is supposedly supporting the migrants. So they are hapless idiots with no capacity to effectuate change in their own countries or to control their own political destiny. Therefore, they have to be allowed into the United States where they're protected. As soon as they cross the border and come into the United States, they're the most hardworking, inventive, innovative, entrepreneurial, politically motivated, and politically correct people that you can possibly find. And therefore, we have to keep them in the United States because they're going to make the U.S. better. Now, both of those things cannot be true at the same time, and this is an absurd argument. And Ann Coulter's written about this. She wrote a great article called "No, the Irish Immigrants Are Not Red-Headed Mexicans," and she talked about the inconsistencies in all of these arguments. But it really, if you're concerned about people in Latin America having better lives and better government, then what you would do is put all of the money that we are wasting on luxury hotels for criminals and are wasting paying Border Patrol agents and air marshals who should be protecting our airlines and our travelers and tourists from foreign countries. We're paying those people to process migrants at the border, which is not their job. If we took the money we were spending on that and we spent it in these countries to help these individuals correct their own situation, then we would be much better off. And yet we never seem to effectively do that. And a lot of people go, oh, well, blah, 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 blah. Hey, the fact is that if a certain number of people in Boston, Philadelphia, Virginia, and other places back in 1776 hadn't decided to take things into their own hands and fix the problems they were experiencing, we'd still be, paying for things with money that had the Queen's picture on it. And this is a country that was built by people that took their own political destiny into their own hands and built the most prosperous and free country in the entire world. So it's absurd to think that we can't assist other people in doing that in their own country. Why do we have to let them all here in the United States, which then causes a financial and a brain drain, which just perpetuates the cycle, and things never get any better in places like Latin America and Africa.
Drawing upon your years of experience with government service in this area, assuming someday there's a federal government under new management, let's say, the question is, can any of this be reversed? Can we ever go back to pre-2021 levels? And if so, what are the big strokes on how we get there?
Sure, it's very simple. I mean, the first thing is close the border. Second thing is deport all the illegals. And the third thing is start applying the immigration laws as they're written. This, the current administration's ridiculous claim that they couldn't do anything about the immigration situation unless Congress passed this ridiculous immigration package that would have made the border worse than it currently is, if you can imagine that. It was a lie because, first of all, we know this because Trump won Trump v. Hawaii at the Supreme Court when the Supreme Court said, yeah, the president under 8 U.S.C. 1182F has the authority to shut down the border to certain classes of aliens or all aliens when he deems their presence in the United States not to be in the best interest of the nation. And the current administration completely ignored that and acted like Trump v. Hawaii never took place. They tried to push this horrible immigration package, which was defeated in the House, as it should have been. And then they tried to blame everyone who voted against the package for the problem and said, oh, we can't do anything. Then when they started their approval ratings started plummeting in the polls because they weren't securing the border, they put out this dim-witted, half-baked proclamation that supposedly was going to fix the problem. And what did they use? The very 8 U.S.C. 1182F authority to make changes to admissions at the border that they claimed they didn't have in the first place. So it's, and if the American people feel like they were lied to, that's because they were.
Now, the remedies you proposed, they all sound common sense based. Now, we know there would be considerable pushback by the usual people, usual suspects. How do we overcome that? Because I'm sure we can expect places like the ACLU to just go crazy with litigation and getting things stopped and all this sort. I mean, can all that be overcome?
Yeah, I think it can. One of the problems with the immigration law right now is there's been a whole bunch of things that were built in as civil rights or as constitutional protections that have nothing to do with that. And if they were just stripped out by executive action, which they could be because they don't have anything to do with statutes or the Constitution, and they were just taken off the books, you may wind up litigating over whether the government has the right to stop doing those things, but eventually the government would prevail on that. There was an 1896 case called EQ v. United States. And the Supreme Court, in a case that's never been overruled and I think was never modified for that matter, said that when it comes to immigration and when it comes to foreign nationals, due process is whatever process the political branches of government, meaning Congress and the executive, decide to give them. So if there's a statute that says X, that's what controls, and the foreign nationals, particularly when they're outside the United States asking to be let in, aren't entitled to anything more than that. You have a very slightly higher Fourth Amendment interest, general due process interest, and search and seizure interest that applies to people who are in the United States. But the fact is, most of them are removed civilly, and it's a different set of standards that have been widely misrepresented by the ACLU and similar organizations.
So, Matt, as reluctant as our government currently seems to be about deporting people or checking them out before they come in, what can be done as far as vetting? Because we know a lot of these people come from countries where the record keeping is poor and all of that, but is there more we could be doing to screen these people prior to them entering the country?
Yeah, a lot of these people weren't screened at all, despite what the government is telling people. I mean, there was an individual who had been a police officer in Brazil who was wanted, I think, for homicide. They had a couple of people who were wanted in Venezuela. If you were able to find out afterwards that these people were wanted in foreign countries, then you were able to find out ahead of time. I mean, there may be a few small cases where a government in response to journalistic inquiries afterwards says, well, yeah, the person did have a warrant out, but we didn't submit it to Interpol or anything like that. That can happen, but I would say with the vast majority of these cases, with the serious crimes that these people were wanted for, based on my experience with vetting, there should have been a way to figure this out. But it really points up the bigger problem, which is, why are we in such a hurry to let any of these people in? This is our country. None of these people are coming here. I mean, this isn't like some computer genius Soviet dissident that we know this person is going to help us, perfect the mission of Mars. Like, a lot of these people have a third grade education and no marketable job skills. They can't speak English. And so what is up with the big deal that, the argument that they somehow need protection or asylum is absurd because most of them are 5, 6, 7 countries away from their home country. And there's, no reason to believe that the governments in their home countries are seeking them here in the United States. I mean, sometimes when you encounter people who are dissidents in China, there's a real honest-to-God concern that the Chinese government may be trying to harm them here. We witnessed a few years ago the Chinese government, the PRC, opening up police stations in the United States and then attempting to arrest people and hold them accountable to Chinese law when they're well outside the jurisdiction of the Chinese government. That's not happening in Latin America. So the vast majority of this is happening because the current administration has told Border Patrol and ICE and USCIS, your job is to head them up, move them out. And we want you to not bother vetting any of these people, let them into the United States, and then process them for some kind of benefit so that they're on a path to citizenship as quickly as possible. And whether that be a real benefit because they happen to qualify for something, in the rare case that that's true, or whether it be a made-up benefit like DACA and this latest parole in place program that these people are unlawfully trying to impose, that's the end goal, is they want to change the demographics of the country, not for any kind of freaky racial or whatever kind of concerns. I mean, you have a lot of whack jobs out there arguing about those things. It's just simple electoral mathematics. They think that if they create the amnesty that allows these people to become U.S. citizens, then these individuals will vote for whoever gave them the opportunity to remain in the United States until the end of time.
Did you happen to catch the interview? Don Lemon interviewed Elon Musk on X, and,
Yes.
and Don Lemon said, "Well, what's all this replacement theory talk? Because people here illegally can't vote." And Elon had to educate him as to the idea of congressional reapportionment, and he acted like he'd never heard of it before.
Well, it's ridiculous, and you know the whole replacement theory name is controversial. Frankly, I think that's a name that has been created by the anti-borders contingent to tar and feather people who want secure borders as racists and kooks who believe in some kind of biological destiny. It's nothing like that. It's the simple thing. This is politics that goes back to the Roman Empire. When you give the voters something, you expect the voters in return to continue casting votes for you so that you can give them more things. And that goes on to a certain extent in the United States above board, where you vote for the person who you think is going to, implement the policies that you think are most beneficial for the country. But it also goes on in the gray zone, where you have certain parties that want to change things. And, first of all, this notion illegal aliens can't vote. You're right, they can't, but they do. Because we know that in places like California, the Department of Motor Vehicles has said, we don't check whether people are citizens. We just process their motor voter applications and register them to vote. Plus, you've also had places like California, Chicago, the District of Columbia, try and pass non-citizen voting laws that would allow people to vote allegedly just in municipal elections and in some cases state elections. But the thing is, state voter databases don't differentiate between who can vote in what types of elections. They just have voters listed. So that whole thing is just absurd. And I think Elon Musk was onto something, because there's a Supreme Court case that I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg authored the opinion, saying that you have to count illegal aliens in apportionment calculations in order to determine how many seats a state has in the House, because, well, those are people who are living here and need to be represented. And that's the same kind of ill-considered erroneous thinking that led to the Plyler v. Doe case, which says that states are obligated to provide illegal alien children with a free public education. And then, we wonder why all of our schools are continuously facing a budget shortfall.
You mentioned how easily the government's currently letting these people into the country, but it seems like it's much more complicated to get them back out. A lot of times we hear these countries where they came from won't take them back. That's kind of a clue maybe about the quality of citizen or person we're taking on into this country. But should it be easier to deport, and if so, how?
So, just to set the context for all of this, the reason that most of these countries don't want to take people back is not just because people are criminals. They don't want to take the good people back. They don't want to take doctors and lawyers back. Why? because doctors and lawyers, once they get through the certification process here in the United States, make comparatively more money than they would have made in their home countries, just based on the different scale of the salaries and the value of the currency. So what happens, there's like $65 billion worth of cash, of capital, that's earned in the United States by foreign nationals living here, which is sent home as remittance payments. And so a whole bunch of these small countries in Latin America, their biggest industry contributing to the gross national product is remittance payments that come from the United States. So they don't want anybody back, because if those people are back home, they're earning money in the local currency and they're not contributing to the economy at the same level that they are when they're in the United States. Now, there is a section of the Immigration and Nationality Act that allows the president to impose sanctions on countries that won't take their citizens back. In particular, they can say, well, we're not giving you any non-immigrant visas until you start taking these people back. Overall, as far as getting rid of these people, there has been a tendency for ICE to err on the side of caution and put people into removal proceedings before the immigration court, even when people aren't entitled to a hearing. And so there are two things. There is expedited removal, which allows people who have just come into the United States to be removed without any kind of a hearing. There's a number of different subcategories of it. So, people who are found here with, I think more than 2 misdemeanor crimes, any kind of a felony crime, can all be subjected to expedited removal. And then there's administrative removal, which is a whole separate category, which has to do with people who are at a port of entry and are requesting admission to the United States and how they're excluded. So, these things are all very complicated. I don't want to bore people with the details, but they are methods whereby the U.S. can say, you've got no equities here, you're a foreign national, you may have been in the country for, a few weeks, a few days, but boom, you're gone without a hearing. The other thing that the immigration court needs to do is it needs to address the backlog. The hearings are too long. It took me an average, I would get asylum cases that had no validity whatsoever on the face. The things that the people were saying constituted persecution didn't. So the story that they were telling was not one that would ever get you asylum. And yet, because of bad precedent, bad policies, I had to sit there and I had to listen to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hours of testimony on these cases before I could enter an order of removal. So the immigration court needs to have the power that all other courts have to dismiss bogus cases when they encounter cases that are bogus on their faces. And it's, a lot of this is willful blindness or intentional misfeasance, because the policy goals behind the decisions that are being made are to keep these individuals in the United States. And so if we focus on what the law says, which is they're not U.S. citizens, they weren't invited here, they don't have authorization to be here from the government, therefore they need to go, then the whole process becomes much simpler.
So, Matt, to tie this discussion in a bow, despite the protestations of these inside the Beltway Chamber of Commerce friendly think tanks that tell us of the limited connection between illegal immigration and crime, I think we've shown here that there is a very significant connection, and it's gotten exponentially worse the last few years. What are your final thoughts on what do we do here?
Well, I think it's definitely getting worse. I think you'd have to be blind not to see it. And, the question is now, what's going to be done about it? Because if this keeps going on, eventually the U.S. is going to look like the Wild West. And you're going to have too many bad hombres and not enough people in a position to do anything about it. Hopefully the tide is changing. Even a lot of the sanctuary cities seem to be losing patience with this. They're realizing it's costing them money, it's costing them votes. I think a lot of the empty virtue signaling behavior may have been cured by all of this. But the fact is that if you want the rule of law to prevail in your country, then it has to start with a border, because the border is what determines what law prevails and where it prevails. And if you just erase the border, then that kicks one of the three legs out from under the stool, and the whole rule of law situation starts to degrade and fall apart to the point where you can lose control. And that can happen either from people coming in, or it can happen like some of the things that we saw during the pandemic with violent protests throughout the United States. God forbid you have both of those things happen at once. So it's very simple. No border, no country. We need to reestablish the border if we want to save our country.
Congratulations, you made it to the end of the podcast. If you'd like to learn more about the Immigration Reform Law Institute, go to irli.org. If you found this information useful and you'd like to support the show, go to irli.org/podcast. You can also hear this show on Apple Podcasts, Rumble, and Spotify. And don't forget to check us out on all the major social media platforms. Thanks again.